And so with that said, I want to welcome you all to the first talk in our STEM and Society lecture series. So this is an event being held by the Graduate Student Organizing Committee, and what we do is we campaign to form a graduate student union at the University of Pittsburgh. And so our hope is that we can just impact some, create some meaningful change within the university and give graduate students a voice that we kind of think they've been robbed of for a little bit, more than a little bit. But regardless of your thoughts on unions, though I tend to know most of you in the room right now, there are obviously plenty of ways to impact meaningful change. And we think one of them is to kind of break science out of this vacuum that it's lived in for a long time and talk about the intersection between science and society. And so that's going to be kind of the focus of these roughly once a month talks. And so having said that, I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker, Emily. She's a fifth-year PhD student in chemical engineering in the Shoemaker Lab. And she works on viruses and kind of modeling the human immune response to these viruses. That's not what her talk is today, but she can introduce her talk herself. So with that said, Emily, take it away.
Thanks. I'm gonna share my screen here. So I renamed my talk and I didn't tell anyone. So today I'm going to talk about the way I envision the cycle of accessibility and tech. And for kind of reference, my slides are on my website at EmilyAckerman.netlify.com if it's easier for you to follow along there or if you need them for some reason. So I thought that I would introduce myself in case you don't know me. This is me. I'm actually a sixth year, Brian. We're getting old. In chemical engineering. And I spend most of my time doing systems biology, but I also spend a lot of time doing activism, essentially. An important note about me, as you can see, I'm a lifetime wheelchair user. And that kind of shapes the way I view the world. And so I think that's enough of a qualification to give this talk, but to kind of start off of why I've been thinking about this topic so much, I'll tell you a little story about what happened to me. So these are Starship robots. They are food delivery, autonomous vehicles that Pitt contracted last year to basically deliver food from dining services to students. There's like an app that they use. My cat's here. And they are free roaming around campus based on a map that at first they were trained on with a human behind them to kind of learn what the map should look like. But then one day at the beginning of semester last year, they were just by themselves and they were wandering around delivering food. And if you were around, you might have seen me on the news because what happened was I had an encounter with one of these robots at the intersection from Kathy to the Chimney Plaza side. There was a lot of people waiting to cross the street in front of me, so I couldn't really see what was going on. And the horde kind of started moving, so I followed them. And when I got across the street, I realized that one of these robots was sitting basically directly in the curb cut, right at the edge of the street. And it was blocking the ramp that I needed to get back on the sidewalk. And the light was kind of starting to turn, and I had to figure out what to do because I was trapped in the street. So I thought about turning around and going back across, but the light was ending. So I panicked and kind of hopped myself up the curb next to the curb cut, which is dangerous for my body. It's painful, as well as I could get stuck, which would not be a good thing. And, you know, I just turned around and looked at it because this was a robot that didn't know what it was doing. It didn't know that I was a human and that it had trapped me in a very dangerous place potentially. And I walked away and I turned around again and it was just sitting there, and I walked further and looked back and it was just sitting there. And I was just beside myself because it was such a major accessibility issue. I knew that it was going to keep happening if I didn't say anything. And I did what anyone who is angry does, which is write some angry tweets. And for accountability, I tagged both the company and the university, and kind of caused like an internal frenzy where they pulled them off the streets essentially that day. And as you can see, there's about 3,000 retweets and 4,000 likes. So this blew up, and it reached some very interesting parts of Twitter. First, this very like sympathizing crowd where people were tagging me, tagging their universities where they had similar robots, providing me proof of similar experiences. And this was happening all over the country because Starship targets universities. That's where it mainly is. There was also a response from this tech crowd who was using it as an example of why we should be diversifying design teams in tech. The disabled community was up in arms because this is just a new thing that we have to worry about. And this was kind of the first time that I'd never seen anything like this, and now that it's a little more common. And then this one really interested me. This group of people who were well-meaning but kind of ableist, where they would be like, those are for lazy people. Like, why do we need them? They're like, these are awful. Which I thought was interesting to be directed at me, given that in their best kind of design, these robots would be very helpful to the disabled community to get basic needs like food or medicine. So this response was very overwhelming. And at the same time, I was all over the news. I had all kinds of news agencies calling me. And at the same time, I had communications with Pitt and with the company. The company had issued an apology to me, essentially, publicly. And they had kind of explained to me that it was a bug, that it wasn't supposed to be where it was, that the map was wrong, and that they were trying to kind of commit themselves to our community, and and say that it was a mistake and that they're committed to helping us. But around the same, or I guess the next day, the company asked to meet with me again after they had reviewed video, which I said fine because I had nothing to hide. And in the meantime, they publicly retracted their apology and issued a statement that said they were happy to see that I got around the robot, that there was no problem, and that they were committed again. And this released kind of this onslaught of internet and news agencies calling me. I woke up to memes and comments calling me by name and saying that I had ruined things, that I had lied, and it was a really awful experience to be subjected to that kind of hatred for just asking to be safe and to, have the right to the sidewalk, essentially. And it was just this 180. I felt really awful and unsafe. And, the Post-Gazette wrote this op-ed commending me. There was another 180, and it was just like a very wild couple of days. And things calmed down, but out of it came a bunch of other wild things. So I wrote an op-ed. I was asked to write this op-ed for City Lab. I was profiled for National Geographic, which has been delayed by the pandemic, and I'm so sad. The South Korean English news station wanted to interview me. They were in Pittsburgh for a day, and I couldn't meet with them. I was the feature in a Financial Times article about AI and disability bias. I'm in a law review about the ethical implications and legal implications of food delivery robots specifically. And then I fielded a bunch of emails. This is a direct quote, but I got a variety of them. This one says, the delivery robots are currently traveling around the redacted campus and have already endangered one of my advisees' lives. He uses a wheelchair. And this was a professor who was secretly emailing me because she was worried about tenure, but she wanted to figure out how best to fight her university, essentially. And I got so many of these, and I still get them to this day. And I guess the big question is, like, how did we get to this point? Like, what allowed this whole experience to happen to me? And after some thinking and like real retrospection on this over the past year, it's kind of come down to two different questions for me. So the first is, how is technology so actively inaccessible? And what do I mean? So this is the cousin of the Starship robot. It's another micromobility. It's a motorized dockless scooter. So the draw is that you can hop on and hop off anywhere. And the reality of that is that they are everywhere, and they are on their sides, on the sidewalk, in large groups. And I've encountered them in other cities, and they are just the worst. And people like me can't walk over them, can't pick them up to move them. 2 days ago, I saw one of the brands, there's a bunch of different brands. One is making it so that when you move it without paying, it actually calls the police, which horrifies me, knowing that 1 in 4 Black adults are disabled, 1 in 6 Hispanic adults, and knowing the trends of use of force specifically against disabled people. Use of force incidents are about 50% of those people identify as disabled. And so the idea that this is now a new level where we're calling the police on marginalized people for a technology that's inaccessible to them. Like, I would never use this. And yet it's still like actively harmful to me in so many ways. 2 other common examples: websites with informational images can't be read by screen readers. And in a world where we rely on video so much, subtitles can be unreliable or non-existent when it's really important. And this question can be further narrowed down into, how are accessible solutions so actively inaccessible? So the example is Xbox controller that was put out last year that's adaptive. It's huge and it has big buttons. So people like me can equally participate in Xbox games, which is great, until you realize that it costs $100 to the $60 that a regular controller costs. And that's a huge barrier for a lot of people, which leads me to my two least favorite parts of accessible tech, the exoskeleton and the stair climbing wheelchair. These are technologically advanced. I know a lot of people, myself included, are very against the idea of exoskeletons, particularly because there's a lot of focus on fixing bodies instead of environments on that one. But in general, just this problem of forcing someone to buy what turns out to be $40,000 tech to access the environment, where the onus should be on the environment to be accessible to people no matter how much they can afford tech-wise. Especially knowing in our current insurance system, things that are not medically necessary are not covered. This is not medically necessary. And that would mean you would have to buy it yourself. And that kind of feeds into this question, which I sadly know the answer to. How are we still so far behind, right? So 15% of the world's adults are estimated to be disabled. It's a very hard number to pinpoint. And in the US, for example, a disabled adult makes $21,000 for the $31,000 that an able adult makes. To gain government benefits like insurance that we use for health care, for paying for aid care, for our wheelchairs and scooters, you have to be living below poverty line to get those benefits. So most of us are living lower than that. Internet use, 54% of disabled adults have access to the internet, where 81% of able adults do. And this ties into education. So undergrads in STEM with a disability is 11%, not reflective of 15%. And even worse, doctoral degrees, 6.8% is all that's awarded to people with disabilities. And so when we look at the tech industry, for example, Google, we see the same trends. Only half of what we would expect if we were reflecting the world self-identify as having a disability. And this is not just developers, but all Google employees. And it's also worth noting that 2019 is the first year that this number has been reported by Google. And when I was making this talk, I wanted to see kind of the state of things. So I was Googling the big tech giants to see what the representation was like. And the sad truth is that all these companies are very willing to write a statement of inclusion or mention what a good place is to work when you're disabled, but they will not provide statistics for the number of people who identify as disabled in their company. So here's a list of some examples. IBM, Amazon, who comically wrote this blog post about why they choose to include, as if we needed them to choose to do that. Oracle, Facebook, which again was named the best place to work for being disabled in 2018, but their diversity report doesn't even include the word disabled. We don't exist to them. And then we got Uber, Apple, Microsoft. You get the idea. It's just everyone is willing to give this lip service and to say that they're committed, much like I saw from Starship. And when it really comes down to it, they have no action behind that. And I think it's pretty interesting, given that disabled people are more likely to be reliant on tech. In 2020, we tend to think of tech as like the future, that SpongeBob episode where like everything is Chrome and We've got robots doing stuff for us. But tech doesn't have to be so advanced. It can just be an application of some kind of STEM advancement. And so here in 1960, this bus with a wheelchair lift, to me, would have been like so technologically advanced. It would have changed my life. We can go further back. In 4th grade, we all learn about simple machines and what good they can do. The ramp being one of them. A ramp is an incredibly important piece of tech for a lot of mobility impaired people. And so, there's so many historical kind of examples of ways that this kind of tech has been withheld from our community. And I can name them all day, but I think a great one is Ed Roberts. Ed Roberts was the first student to go to Berkeley in a wheelchair in 1962. He was admitted after actually fighting the admissions committee, who said that they had already tried disabled people and it didn't work. And Ed was forced to live in a hospital when he finally got there because he relied on an iron lung to breathe at night, which is tech for the most basic human need. And they wouldn't allow him to live in a dorm with an iron lung. And so when he began traveling from the hospital to school, he realized that there were no curb cuts in the city, and his wheelchair had to be in the street, essentially. And so Ed and a lot of other activists that I owe everything to led a fight to put curb cuts in the city that inspired not just the Bay Area, but just all of America and the world. This is a picture of slightly later, the ADAPT Denver group, who was a pretty revolutionary at the time, on the ground kind of activist group. And they're sledgehammering the sidewalk out to make a curb cut, which I love. Let me know if you want to do that. And more examples. So the Civil Rights Acts didn't include disabled people. So all of the fights that had been previously undertaken and more had to be refought by disabled people. So transportation was a huge fight. Disabled people would stop traffic in New York City. They would shove their wheelchairs under the bus so it couldn't move. They would sleep on the ground. And it took that much extreme activism to get equal access to public entities like transportation. And if you fast forward a little bit, the ADA is kind of what covers, or the last piece of legislation that really covers disability. And I bring up the ADA because of a few reasons. One, it's very relevant in what it covers to this talk. It covers employment discrimination, public entities, and telecommunications, notably. And this picture is of disabled activists who dragged themselves up the 80 steps of the Capitol, called the Capitol Crawl, to protest the government essentially just sitting on this legislation for a very long time. And the ADA is kind of one of the last pieces of legislation specifically for us. And there's a lot of problems, which I'm going to come back to, but they're based around this language that comes back to haunt us, where things need to be reasonable or readily achievable or easily accomplished by these institutions. And if they are not reasonable, they don't need to be done. And so this is kind of what comes back. We'll circle back to that. But I am a part of the ADA generation, which is those of us who were born right after it passed. I was in public school, which up until the 70s, I would have been forced into at least a separate school, if not some kind of institution. I graduated undergrad. I wrote grad school letters about what it meant to be a disabled scientist. And ultimately, here I am today doing science. So I would be remiss without the activism and my disabled ancestors who are still fighting today. But things are not great. And there's lots of examples in the tech industry of reasons why the ADA is insufficient. And here's a really blaring example. So air transportation is one of the oldest tech industries in this country. Air travel is private, so it falls under this Air Carriers Act, which often results in things like this. So this is, on the left, a man is strapped into a very institutional looking temporary wheelchair because you're not allowed to bring your tech onto airplanes, wheelchairs specifically, and scooters. And his real wheelchair, which I assure you cost $30,000 or $40,000, is next to him demolished. The back is ripped off. The controllers looks like it's ripped off. Someone's holding a random part. There's random parts in the seat. And the second photo, again, this wheel is ripped off. The wires are ripped. Both of these are going to take months. And that's months that these people can't leave their house, go to work, go to school, or maybe even get out of bed. And so the problem is, under this kind of law, individuals cannot file lawsuits based on these kind of violations. They have to be class action, if I recall correctly. And the airline is responsible for the damages. However, it takes months and they don't care how quickly it happens. And it is literally like life ruining. And 700 wheelchairs, for example, in December 2018, were damaged by the 12 most popular US airlines. So again, this is super common to the point where I refuse to fly. And this has tangible effects on my life. So I don't go to weddings. I don't see my family that lives more than a car ride away. In my career, I don't go to conferences. When I'm trying to get a job and tenure someday, hopefully I won't be able to go to job talks as easily. I refuse to fly unless truly needed until this industry has guaranteed me the respect and the safety that I deserve, that they've had, decades and decades to give to me. And so what I hope I've shown here is that the present is scary. It's very scary to be disabled and in the world. And therefore, the future is scarier because we don't know where it's going. I can't dream of the next terrible invention that's going to impact my life. And, we're headed for some kind of like Jetsons future, it seems like, but who's driving this little spaceship? And, how do I get to drive the spaceship? Like, I want to decide where we're going. And I guess, like, now is a good time to bring up the one semi-valid criticism that I'll hear, which is, people always say, well, nobody's applying to our jobs or to our company or to our department. And I would hire them if they existed. but it's not my fault that they're not applying. So like, I'll just wait till they apply, which is true. We are not applying in large numbers, but that's because poor representation has systematically kept us out. And to achieve representation, there's actually two barriers in the way. The first is equal access to tech as just humans of the world. We don't have equal access to the internet, to the assistive technology that we need to get out of bed or leave our house, go to school. And once we get that tech, there's another barrier of staying inside of academic institutions that were never made for us, and staying inside industries where we're the only one, and where things are actively being designed to keep us out. And as a result of needing to climb both of these barriers, the tech industry is just a place where the people inside right now are responsible for anticipating the needs of everyone. Whether or not they've met them, know they exist, they're responsible. And that is not the way it should be. And to me, the goal is a future where, first, they're not responsible for foreseeing that. There's enough representation. We recognize that experiences are not monoliths, so we don't just have like one token disabled person and call it a day. And also, not everyone's going to be a developer, but the burden shouldn't fall on the user to protest, and to have that protest heard by large companies and institutions that are running under capitalism, where things benefit them, and it's easier to just keep going than to listen to a minority of unmarginalized people. And so I'd like to shift our thinking about this problem into being a temporary problem, where everything that we do is addressing this goal. Everything that we actively put out into the world is attempting to kind of rectify this. And so I'm an engineer, and we love cycles, and we love feedback, and we love making systems out of things. So I envision this as a positive feedback solution, where first, all of us developers and not want better tech. We want the best that we could possibly have. To me, that means more accessible tech, and to a lot of people, both in availability, monetary, and just availability wise, but also in the disability sense of being accessible. By providing better tech, we allow greater access to education for a larger group of diverse people. And those people will, some of them will enter STEM, and if they have that tech to support them, they will be more likely to succeed in the educational endeavor, and end up in the industry where they're responsible for designing better tech. And when we're designing, we think of ourselves as a user, and things will become more and more accessible. And this just kind of feeds back on itself. And I can't tell you, a step-by-step solution to fix this, but I do have some kind of thoughts on the way that we can amp up this cycle. So it's three parts. First is a no-brainer. The industry has to diversify, and multi-level involvement here is really the key. So this is the engineering design process. The idea is that you ask the question, like, what do we need? You imagine different solutions that you could create. Then you plan which one you're going to build. You create it and you test it over and over until you're happy with your product. And so when we ask questions, we should be asking, who is the user? What are their needs? And a big part of this is that a lot of design has to do with the public, and things that we put out publicly for use need to include the disabled. And not thinking about the disabled or any other marginalized group is not really addressing who is the user. And when we imagine different solutions, we can say, well, how will these different solutions affect the disabled, right? What is kind of the effect of all of these different solutions, so that when we choose a specific one, we can ask ourselves, is this serving minorities? Is this actively helping, or is it actively harmful? And lastly, in the testing phase, what is user feedback? We need, our companies need to have routes for people to give that feedback, whether it's in focus groups or in, from users after it's already out. And active listening in that context, not just kind of background noise, which is what we tend to end up being. And right now, the industry is really only relying on this last phase. In my case, it was me causing a ruckus that got their attention. And as soon as they could kind of push me aside, the robots were back on the street within 3 or 4 days. But what people need to realize is that by asking these questions further up the line, you are saving time, you are saving money, you are saving face for your company. Because I am not going to sit around and allow this to happen over and over, right? I'm going to keep making a fuss about problems when I see them. And the best way to kind of address these questions further up the pipeline is to actually have representation. Because when I design, I think about myself, and that would allow these questions to be answered much earlier in the process. And we need to kind of understand that these inaccessible solutions are not neutral. They're actively harmful. And it doesn't matter the intention, whether it was accidental or whether you meant well. One response that I got from the company was that I should be thankful because these robots were going to deliver medicine to me because I'm disabled, so I need medicine. And I was shocked because there's no way that something that's actively harmful to me can ever be beneficial. It's not just neutral if I can't use it. It's not just neutral if it's in my way, it's causing danger, right? This is actively harmful to me. And by diversifying, we also get greater recognition of voluntary versus involuntary users. So I was actually not a user of Starship. I was just there. And if I had been on a team designing this robot, I would have identified very early in this process what a problem it was going to be for me and for others who are, have mobility impairments and vision impairments and things. And the recognition of that is something that comes from that representation. The next point is that the industry has to slow down, which is incredibly controversial in STEM. But the harmful solution isn't just good because it's first. And I'm a researcher, and I understand the push to get your work out first is so strong for monetary reasons, for getting your name, for career advancement. I understand that companies in our life are functioning under these capitalist needs, and yet I do not accept it. That is the problem, because a harmful solution isn't acceptable. It should not be out just because it's first. And the reason that it's such a scary thing for me to see is that reactionary legislation is slow. I mentioned with the ADA that things are very vaguely put as far as what's reasonable, and the ADA is a fairly dead document in that it did not plan for the future. The tech world was not really on their minds beyond telecommunications. And as a result, I am not protected in this context. And companies like Starship are actively lobbying in many states, succeeding in giving their robots and similar robots pedestrian rights, which means that me and a robot have the same pedestrian rights. But the difference is I am a human and it's a robot, and I will not have protection in this context or any context against that. And that really worries me. And that kind of feeds into this idea of ethical decision making. How do we make ethics a part of this kind of design process? And I know that people are actively working on that, but getting that into companies and into the ethos of the way we develop tech is a large mountain that we need to climb very quickly. Because at the moment, I have no trust. I don't trust companies to have my best interest in mind. If they did, they wouldn't detract apologies and make fake commitments. I know that they don't have me in mind. And so this move fast and break things ethos that we've developed and have forcefully just like chugged into the future on is at the expense of the marginalized. And we cannot let that continue. And the last point that I want to make is about education, which is kind of its own large talk, but I want to touch on it because I think there are tangible things that we can do in our communities. So what can we do in our departments, our companies, our communities, our activism spaces is a huge one to make education more accessible. Does your department have money for funding talks about things like this? Do they fund REU students, which tend to be more likely from marginalized communities and don't get the same opportunities that other research undergraduates would get? What can you do in your activism to make things more accessible? Education is such a broad term in this context, but the idea is that we can all make a difference in our own space that we occupy. And this is a question I love asking people around me. do you have disabled role models? Do your families, your kids, do your friends? And this is really big for me because the kind of historical context for a lot of why education has been limited and access to spaces has been limited is because there's this ingrained view that the disabled are not either suited for education or they're not able to be to the same caliber. And that, while it sounds like extreme and dated, is still incredibly present in the minds and opinions of people. The response I get when I tell people that I'm a PhD student is wild. And so yeah, if you're looking for these people, if you're actively using disabled role models in your life, this becomes normalized, and your kids will be normalized to this idea that of course they should be there, of course they should be represented in the future, or now, hopefully. And last is for researchers, specifically in STEM. How can you make your work less of a black box to the public? And I bring this up because when Starship was put onto the streets, there was no information about them. There was no info on how they worked, what to do, what not to do when you see them. And as a result, they're really confusing. I have some robotics training. I understood the way the sensor worked and that I shouldn't be sitting directly in front of it because it wasn't going to back up. And most people don't have that, and we shouldn't expect them to. But if you're putting something out into the world that's affecting the lives of the public, and specifically something that's interfacing badly with the marginalized communities in your public space, it's your job to make that less of a black box, to help people understand how this tech works. Because we are very quickly advancing on this technological future that is kind of scary. And if we don't bring everyone with us by educating them on how things work and giving them access, things are going to be even more inequitable than they already are. So with that, I will remind you that this is just a temporary problem. And I thank you for hopefully contributing to the needs of the disabled community, which are recognition of our experience, creating ethical and equitable solutions, and actively bringing us in to your spaces. So thank you, and feel free to look me up. Again, the slides are online, and I'm happy to talk about any of this with anyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
I think we have a small enough group that if anyone has any questions, you can just unmute yourselves. I won't make anyone queue up. So with that said, does anyone have any questions for Emily? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I have to head out to another Zoom meeting because that's our lives now. But I did want to ask you, Emily, thank you so much. It was so great to hear more about this after observing the event happen on Twitter earlier. I was thinking about particularly your last points about education in terms of access, but I'm also thinking about it, of course, I don't know all of you, I'm from a humanities department, so thinking about how to bring ethics into STEM education, and then also thinking about fields that have been historically asking the kind of questions you're talking about in disability studies, and that what we're seeing, I mean, even at our own institution, is that those departments are getting destroyed. So just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, Yeah, it's interesting because it just kind of backs up the idea that like we're not even valued enough in this academic space for people to have the opportunity to like learn about the ways that we've been discriminated against. And you know, I hope that you know that trend of kind of like taking this this away, I guess, this access to learning about it and to studying it and furthering the field, I guess, ends. But I hope that we seek it wherever we can, because there's really, you could put this anywhere, because the history of the disability community is so rich and so full of everything from stories to theory to science, and I would really love if people would work it into the way that they teach, whether it's acknowledging that someone who invented what you're teaching is disabled, or bringing in speakers who are from disabled and other marginalized communities to give a visual representation that we exist and that we are doing the work, whether or not it's related to disability. I think that's hopefully one way I would like to, in the future, like bring this to every room that I'm in, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was so wonderful. And now I have to go, but thank you.
Thanks for coming.
If anyone, oh yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Hi, Emily. That was wonderful. So we know each other through workplace organizing, and I was wondering if you could speak to, I guess, two things. One, how we can ensure that our organizing around labor is accessible and meets the needs of disabled folks, and also how getting a union in an academic setting would help folks with disabilities and like as a woman in science too.
Yeah. So I guess for activism in general, my opinion is that I wish that every other organizing space operated like a disability organizing space. And there are some great workshops that I can possibly find a link to if you're interested. But the idea is that we place so much focus on putting yourself first, not in a selfish way, but in a like, are my needs met kind of way. And that really influences, I think, the way I would like to see activism. For example, you know, if your main method of activism is standing outside for 3 hours to protest, that's great. But don't expect everyone to show up, because not everyone can do that. And understanding that it's fine that nobody is expected to show up is really important. Or making sure that your materials, your videos, no informational images, things like that, making sure your websites are accessible is a great way to spread information for your organizing cause in, you know, an equitable way. And I guess as far as unionizing, one kind of really important thing to me is just having accountability from department. So things like needing to take leave are very wishy-washy at the moment. And disabled people are more likely to need extended leave or medical leave or things like that. We're also more likely to face discrimination than an average person, given that physical spaces were not made for us, let alone regular interacting with coworkers and PIs and things, knowing the rates of abuse that disabled people take is much higher than your average person. In a more general way, these are all things that can show up in your workplace that we are currently not protected for. And so it's really important to me to kind of get that accountability and protection in case I need it, I guess.
I'm sure we could ask a lot more questions, but I guess in the interest of time, we can wrap up. So thank you so much, Emily. And then for anyone who is still on the call, the next talk is sometime in October. I forget the exact date, but it'll be Kim speaking. So if you guys want to join us for that, that would be awesome. Help spread the word. And if you want to share this talk, I'll have a recording of it posted hopefully later today. But yeah, I don't know. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you all.